I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to the Essential Geopolitics podcast by RANE. Germany is heading to the polls this month in a pivotal election that is set to profoundly reshape its political and economic landscape. With several coalition possibilities still wide open, the outcome will have major implications for domestic policy, EU policies, transatlantic relations, European security, and more. The Christian Democrats are widely expected to lead the next government, likely alongside junior partners from the center or center-left, with a two-party coalition that would provide a more stable government and leaner decision-making processes in Berlin. While another ideological, diverse, and fragile three-party coalition would face the same challenges of the outgoing government. But the big question everybody has is, will Germany's so-called firewall against the far right hold? RANE's Europe analyst Matteo Ilardo is here to help us break it all down. Hi Matteo, how's it going?
Hi Emma, all good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. So can you explain the context in which the election is taking place, like a bit of background, not too much, just like a brief overview of what's happening?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is a key part to start to understand the importance of this specific German election. The stakes have arguably haven't been this high for a few decades. I mean, the election is coming against the backdrop of significant economic headwinds for the German economy. We have stagnating growth, high energy costs, declining industrial competitiveness, and then more structural challenges that have been affecting the German economy for a while and are now becoming more obvious with such low growth, such as an aging workforce, labor shortages, stagnating investment, and all of that has raised serious questions about the very viability of Germany's economic model in the new world. I mean, a model that for the past few decades has relied on the peace dividends coming from the end of the Cold War, with the US basically providing security to the rest of Europe, so very low defense spending. We had very cheap energy coming from Russia, powering the German industrial heartland, in a very export-oriented economy that relied on exporting to China everything that it couldn't export to the already very big EU single market. So these three pillars held together the German economy, made it one of the richest countries in Europe, in the world, and is now all coming unraveling because of the changing world, the changing economic and geopolitical landscape. This is certainly key in all parties' electoral campaign, but so is the political environment in which this is all taking place, besides economics. So it's an environment of rising political polarization, the rise of the far right as well as the far left, particularly in the east of the country, and a generally very fragmented political landscape that has made policy making very difficult, and the outgoing, very divided traffic light coalition knows about this. Also, we have growing anti-immigration sentiment, again fueling the rise of the far right, and we saw sadly in recent months several recent terrorist attacks in Germany that only fuel this rise of anti-immigration sentiments, of far right ideologies, and we have a general backlash against a lot of green policies in a country that has been at the forefront of the energy transition in Europe and the world. We also have a changing world more broadly, an increasingly volatile geopolitical landscape, as I was talking about just a second ago, and deteriorating security situation in Europe. The war now is at Europe's doorstep, a key difference from the previous election in 2021. There's high uncertainty over the state and the future of Ukraine and the war and NATO more generally. We saw how the Trump administration is now spearheading effectively peace negotiations with Russia, effectively sidelining Europe. Europe wants to be part of the negotiation process. This is key for the next government. There's a likely coming trade war with the US that will be particularly damaging for such a heavily export-oriented economy such as Germany's. And there are always economic challenges that are growing and growing, posed by China's industrial strategy, industrial overcapacity, and the trade tariffs that that come with it, basically, from the EU and in response from China, and Germany is caught in the middle. And all of this demands more decisive policy response, something that the previous government has failed to provide. So we came from a coalition government that largely failed to address all of this, and the next government will be called to show that it can actually live up to all these challenges.
So who and what, I guess, are the main players in this election, and where do they stand on all these issues?
So the central player here for sure is the center-right CDU, basically the CDU and the SU, basically the alliance between the Christian Democrats and their Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union. They are the ones that have been consistently polling first in Germany ever since the previous election. They maintained a comfortable lead over government parties while at the opposition, and they are clearly the favorite to win the election. The party is the classical European Christian Democratic Party. It's a center-right, pro-business, socially conservative, but also committed to social welfare. It's been the dominant force since the post-war era in Germany, leading unification under Helmut Kohl in the 90s, dominating German politics for decades under Merkel. And while still strong among older and rural voters, it is losing some ground in cities and with the younger generations, many of which are now voting far right. But it remains way ahead in the polls. So the likely new chancellor will in fact be the leader of the CDU, Friedrich Merz, and which will have the challenge of living with the legacy of Merkel, his predecessor at the head of the party, which was very critical with him, and we'll talk about that perhaps a bit more later. The platform of the party is one. It's a classic pro-business agenda: lower corporate taxes, less regulation, limiting welfare spending to some extent. They also want tougher asylum rules, tighter migration policies. On foreign policy, they back stronger ties with the EU as well as the US. Merz in particular is very pro-Atlanticist. He's made it clear he wants to establish good relationship with the Trump administration, despite all the difficulties that we were talking about. And it's more hawkish on Russia compared to the previous government, particularly compared to the SPD, the center-left party of outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And we'll see how that translates into now that the war seems to be going towards a negotiating stage. They also are less ambitious on climate policies. They argue energy security should come before aggressive climate targets, and that may in fact also lead to significant policy changes. Then we have second in the polls the AfD, the far-right government in Germany. Sorry, the far-right party in Germany. Well, we'll see whether that translates into government. I don't think so, but it's polling very high. It's been polling at around, sometimes above 20% for a while now. It's rising. It's riding this wave of far-right, rising, more popular far-right ideologies and anti-immigration sentiments. It combines these nationalist, anti-immigration views with economic protectionism. And an emphasis on cultural war issues as well, lately aligning with the political trends seen in the US as well. It's originally a Eurosceptic party, now a bit less, but still much more Eurosceptic than any other party in Germany. It's fiscally conservative. That's the origin of the party. That's how they came about during the Eurozone crisis, basically opposing any sort of bailout for the Mediterranean countries. They are against green policies. They favor an energy policy that prioritizes bringing energy prices down. And they're very strong. They have a lot of supporters in Eastern Germany among voters frustrated with the political establishment. Then we have the two main government parties, the ones that held the most important ministries in the previous coalition. So we have the SPD and the Greens. They are the main center-left forces in Germany. They share a lot of commitments to welfare policies, to environmental protection. The SPD has roots in labor unions, traditionally represents the working class voters and older demographics, whereas the Green Party tends to appeal more to younger, urban, highly educated and progressive voters. They are often in agreement on many things. One thing they really disagree, and we saw that playing out during the previous government, is foreign policy. The Greens tend to be much more hawkish than the SPD. The SPD tends to be significantly more conservative in that sense. They want. They have been very cautious on Russia. They have been very cautious on China. Sometimes to a frustrating level for a lot of their European allies within the European Union, and this has led to many disagreements within the government. And the other third party of the government is the FDP, which we don't even know whether they'll cross the 5% needed to even win a single seat in the next Bundestag. The FDP of former Finance Minister Christian Lindner, he was the one actually who pulled the plug on the coalition. The party supports very fiscally conservative pro-business agenda, and that led to a lot of disagreements with the former center-left parties in government, particularly over spending and economic reforms.
If you could make some predictions, what do you think will happen in this election, and what would be the main implications of each likely or unlikely scenario?
So as said, the CDU clearly here looks like the likely winner. The AfD has in fact surged dramatically in the polls in the past few years on the back of all the anti-immigration sentiments that we were talking about, but also opposing the war in Ukraine, which helped the party quite a lot in the first years of the war, when the energy crisis led to very high inflation, a very high cost of living. That's less of an issue now for German voters, but it did fuel the party quite significantly. But they remain somewhat stable at around 20% for months. So they don't seem to be, let's say, breaking that ceiling quite significantly. They obviously could score higher. You never know in an election, particularly one that sees such a polarized political environment. But even if they scored higher than 20-25%, which is probably what the best case scenario for the party, I would say, they'll still mostly likely end up at the opposition. A very strong result for the AfD would most likely complicate coalition talks that will nevertheless seek to exclude them from government more than anything, I believe. So the baseline scenario for us at RANE remains that the CDU will in fact lead a two-party coalition or a three-party coalition with a center-left or centrist party, with the SPD, with the Greens, maybe with the FDP if they manage to cross the 5% threshold. And broadly speaking, though obviously to what extent it will depend on the exact composition of the next coalition, this CDU-led government would most likely result in stricter migration policies, though with softer edges because of the presence of center-left parties like the Greens or the SPD, a greater focus on security and border controls with that, a less ambitious climate policies that prioritizes energy security and economic competitiveness over emission reduction targets. That obviously depends whether the Greens will be part of the coalition or not. But if the SDU is the main party in the coalition, anyways, we'll probably see a less ambitious climate policies, regardless of who's in the coalition compared to the previous government. And then we'll see an increased support for traditional industries like automotive, energy-intensive sectors. We see the CDU having very strong ties with these sectors of the German economy. We'll also see quite some policy continuity in areas such as foreign policy and defense. But as said, the CDU is more hawkish than the SPD, quite significantly on certain things. We saw that in Ukraine, for instance. The CDU supported providing Ukraine with long-range missiles and allowing them to use them to strike deep inside Russia, whereas the SPD has always drawn the line there, going against what most other European countries were allowing Ukraine to do. So that will change, but we'll see how that plays out now that we seem like we're heading towards negotiations. So, but generally speaking, we'll have either a two-party coalition that is definitely more stable than the previous one. So it means we'll have more policy certainty, more political stability, less frustration among voters, among industry players, among Germany's own allies in Europe and beyond. Whereas if we have a three-party coalition that remains ideologically divided, then we'll have another fragile government, another government that struggles to take any decision. It takes so long to decide anything because parties need to basically smooth disagreements by throwing money at problems. But Germany also has a lot of fiscal constraints in doing that. And that will require, for instance, that's a big change that the new government will likely bring. It will require most likely a reform of Germany's so-called debt brake, basically something that forces the government to very strict deficit limits, despite Germany having very low debt levels especially compared to other major European economies, and having such a bad need for investment. So the new government will spend more, that's for sure. We then have an unlikely but still possible outcome, and very impactful if it comes about, in case we have a CDU-AfD coalition. I think it remains unlikely that the CDU makes an alliance with the far right, and that's because of Germany's strong tradition of what in Europe is known as cordon sanitaire in French. That's a fancy word for a tendency, a tradition of not collaborating with the far right, keeping it out of government, and that's obviously due to Germany's very particular history in the 20th century under the Nazi regime. And that remained quite strong in Germany. We saw far-right parties in recent years normalizing, entering government either at the head of government or as part of a coalition. We saw parties such as Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, such as Rassemblement National in France of Marine Le Pen, becoming seen just as conservative parties, but not extreme anymore. They can be, other parties can see themselves working with them. This has not happened in Germany. We had very significant backlash recently over an attempt from the CDU to pass, still as an opposition party, a very tough migration legislation with the help of the AfD in parliament. The legislation didn't pass in the end, but the very prospect of having the two parties for the first time ever formally collaborating in the Bundestag to pass a piece of legislation led to a significant backlash from other parties, from German voters, from CDU's own voters, and even from Merkel, the former CDU leaders that really bashed on Merz for having even attempted this. So that remains a very sensitive political issue, and I don't think we are there yet for Germany to normalize the far right yet. So I think despite how well the AfD will likely perform in the election, we'll still have a conservative-led, broad, centrist coalition government in Germany with all the policy implications that will have.
Thanks so much, Matteo. It's always great to hear your insights.
Thank you for having me, Emma.
For more risk insights and analyses, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.